The final episode of Rust Valley Restorers featured the tragic sale. Supporters bid farewell to the renowned junkyard king. But then an odd thing occurred. Episodes continued to emerge. Mike continued to fix automobiles, be on TV, and pursue his ambition. In what way did a man who lost his empire manage to maintain his show? The response exposes something that most viewers were unaware of regarding what actually transpired. On February 4, 1958, Mike Hall was born in the Winnipeg, Manitoba, community of St. Boniface. His family relocated west to Kamloops, British Columbia, when he was still a little boy when his father was hired by the Canadian Pacific Railway. Mike's entire life changed with that move. Living in the interior of British Columbia allowed him to roam freely and explore broad pastures and back roads. It was not long before one thing dominated his entire world. Vehicles. Old, rusted-out wrecks that are abandoned in fields and behind barns, rather than brand new, shining ones. As a teenager in the early 1970s, Mike had already begun breaking into people's backyards and searching for abandoned country roads in search of dead cars that he could revive. Most children were saving money for bikes or records, but Mike was bringing home junkers that nobody else wanted. There was no rust visible to him. He recognized possibilities. To him, a rotting pickup or a beat-up 1950s coupe weren't trash. There was a puzzle that needed to be solved. A few of his pals found it strange. He didn't care that his neighbors stared at him strangely. He was already gathering automobiles and keeping them in storage wherever he could. Mike was certain that he wanted to mend things with wheels at a time when most children were still deciding what they wanted to do with their lives. Mike accumulated hundreds of vintage cars by the late 1970s, when he was in his 20s. He had never attended a vocational school. On his wall were no ostentatious certificates. He did, however, have practical experience. Everything he learned was self-taught. How metal can be shaped, how engines can be rebuilt, and how to revive an automobile. Each crash he brought home became an educational experience. It got difficult to start every engine that refused to start. And gradually, all of that trial and error became expertise. The sort of ability that was not acquired in a classroom. It was the result of long nights spent in icy sheds and broken knuckles. Although Mike Hall didn't grow up with the intention of amassing hundreds of vintage automobiles, his fascination with rust in engines wasn't an unexpected development. He was already making a fortune by blowing up slopes and scaling cliffs in the 1980s, long before the cameras were even there. That was the start of his actual career. He established Chimera Springs Rockworks as his business. And the construction job was not your typical one. Mike was doing nothing like laying bricks or pouring concrete. He was launching controlled explosions, hanging on ropes, and digging into rock walls. Most would not dare to conduct this labor-intensive, hazardous activity. Mike, however, thrived on the rush. He began to be referred to as the Rasta Blasta throughout those years. Both because of his explosive day job and his long, dreadlocked hair. He carried the moniker with him for the remainder of his life. He continued to work in that industry into the 1980s, 1990s, and even the 2000s. He earned considerable money performing blasting and gained notoriety in British Columbia. He was not, however, saving it. Almost all of it was going towards garbage cars. Not just a couple here and there, either. He was ravenous for abandoned automobiles. Whether they were completely rusted or had half of their parts missing made no difference. Mike wanted the car to have a soul or a story, if he believed it. Furthermore, if it needed to be saved, it simply increased his desire for it. He wasn't purchasing gleamingly restored vintages. He had been searching for abandoned rust buckets. Vehicles from all around the world began to flood his land during the ensuing decades. A few of these were uncommon 1960s muscle vehicles. Old European sports vehicles that hadn't been driven in years or beaten-up pickups were among the others. He would use the money he received from blasting rock for a job to bring home another broken machine. People began to inquire about the precise number of cars he owned by the time the 2010s arrived. The figure was astounding. His acreage was home to more than 400 cars, and it wasn't only a collection. It was as far as the eye could reach, a landscape of metal and rust. "I don't collect cars," he used to joke. He amassed rust. Rust Brothers got its name from that. Not all of the men he worked with were laborers or mechanics. They were on the same weird quest. Mike wasn't attempting to establish a showroom or flip automobiles for cash. He was attempting to save devices that others had left behind. Saving them from the scrapyard felt like a victory, even if they were never restored. Mike's talk about those cars made it obvious that it was more than just a passion, even though outsiders didn't always get it. Something more profound was involved. "I couldn't leave a car that needed to be saved," he once stated. They drew him in, and each detonation he set off during the day was a step closer to being able to purchase another piece of rolling history at night. Mike Hall made no genuine effort to gain notoriety. In the Shuswap region of British Columbia, he was already leading a totally different kind of life long before he ever made an appearance on television. On a farm nearby, he had quietly made himself at home in a quiet place remote from the bustle. Despite getting married, he never publicly revealed his wife's identity. Together, they brought up their son, Connor Charman Hall, who was born in the 1980s. Another member of the family that Mike had was a small dog named Minnie. Although the land appeared peaceful, Mike was anything but. Having a wife and child didn't make him any less of an automobile nut. Actually, it created some minor chaos at home. There could be no more junk automobiles on their land, according to a condition his wife had to set. Her goal was to prevent their 26-acre farm from becoming another rust-filled cemetery. Mike, however, didn't argue. He just moved to a new location to pursue his passion. Not far from Shuswap Lake, in the nearby hamlet of Tappan, he purchased a separate 5-acre parcel. Only a short distance from the Trans-Canada Highway, it rose to fame. Later, that location became known as Mike's Field of Dreams. Hundreds of rusty old cars stretched out as far as the eye could reach on this sunburned plot of ground. There were those from the 1940s and those from the 1970s. Others had been buried in grass or torn away entirely. However, Mike believed that all of them still had life left in them. There was no rust visible to him. He recognized possibilities. The 2000s saw Mike's life oscillate between two extremes. He performed his primary duty throughout the day, blasting rocks as a member of a company building a highway. At night, however, he changed. Going to his junkyard, he would work alone like a crazy scientist, trying to revitalize metal that has been forgotten. Even if no one was looking, he didn't care. He had no desire to become famous. Because he loved it, he did it. However, fate had different ideas. In 2016, an unforeseen event occurred. Mike was working in British Columbia's mountains when a large rock slide blocked a highway. Mike Hall was brought in by the cleanup crew because they needed assistance quickly. And when he showed up with his equipment and expertise, a crazy thing happened. The crew of the Discovery Channel chose to feature Mike in one of the episodes of their documentary, Highway Through Hell. At that moment, the world saw him for the first time. Mike, sporting a hard hat and clambering up cliffs as if they were nothing, approached a pile of stones and launched his assault. His well-known Rasta Blasta was employed. To clear the road and break up the rocks, use a dynamite method. Despite only being on screen for a few minutes, the appearance was sufficient. People stopped to pay attention because of his wild energy, outrageous hair, and bold demeanor. By the time Mike Hall reached his late 50s, his sleepy neighborhood in Tappan, British Columbia, had transformed into something that most people couldn't believe until they witnessed it for themselves. More than 500 rusting autos were strewn over acres of land. A few were becoming buried in the soil. Others had weeds half covered them. Mike, however, did not observe rubbish. He witnessed past events. He recognized possibilities. He was familiar with every vehicle. He could identify the make, model, and year simply by looking at them. According to one source, he could even list the characteristics of each of the 562 cars that are strewn about his land. It was not a guess. He recalled each one's meaning for him and where he obtained it. He has been with some of them for almost 30 years. Nearly 40 had been sitting there. cars weren't all they were. He lived for them. But everything was getting out of hand. The dream that had once thrilled him had subtly begun to weigh him down. There was more to storing more than 500 deteriorating autos than merely space. Money was spent on it. Time was needed. It required energy. Additionally, it raised awareness. Occasionally, the incorrect type. Neighbors became interested. Questions from officials began. The indications were too obvious for Mike to ignore. He was letting his body slow down. He acknowledged that he was becoming older in 2020. He freely admitted that he would not have enough time in the remaining years to restore every vehicle he owned. He had seen what happened to those who failed to make plans. Mike was getting close to 60, the same age at which his own father had died. That idea started to trouble him. He had witnessed the deaths or illnesses of friends and fellow collectors, leaving their families in a state of chaos. And he continued thinking about the same question. If he disappeared out of thin air, what would happen to his 500 cars? Not to create drama, but because it was true, he spoke it aloud once. In a field with 400 cars, what will my wife and children do? It was more than a melancholy idea. It served as a warning that would influence every choice he made going ahead. Mike Hall may be ready to slow down after taking a look around his Tappan, British Columbia, property in 2016. Over the course of several decades, he had amassed over 300 vintage cars on 5 acres by chasing rust and building up old wrecks. The amount was excessive. His desire was to leave. Completely, not just a little. Thus, he took a risky choice. He offered everything for sale in one enormous bundle. The rust, the cars, the land, the chaos, and the insanity. There was a $1.19 million asking price. Most people thought that was crazy. Who would want junkers in a field? The ad failed to generate genuine offers. It was seen the same way by all. It was not an automobile collection. It was a garage for scrap. Instead of decreasing the price or giving up, Mike took a completely different approach in 2017. He made it more expensive. He made a $1.45 million request. He was even surprised by what transpired next. The tale went viral. A man who was selling more than 300 vintage autos in 5 acres. People were talking about it non-stop. The images of his car-covered property went viral across Canada as news outlets picked it up and wrote articles about it. Mike was no longer merely a local figure all of a sudden. He turned into a national figure. According to certain news sources, there may even be more than 500 automobiles. The property had become a myth. Automobile aficionados began phoning from all over the nation with haphazard offers in an attempt to purchase particular cars. When the TV folks began calling, however, it was a larger surprise. Among them was the Canadian producer Tyson Hepburn, who had contributed to Highway Through Hell. He knew the rural property and had met Mike before. Now that the internet was ablaze with rumors about this eccentric man who had hundreds of dilapidated cars and a desire to leave them all behind, the notion of a television show didn't seem so crazy. Mike's life appeared to be fiction, something no one else had. Producers made proposals. A dramatic story about disarray and garbage was what some wanted. However, Mike clarified one point. He preferred not to appear on television unless it was about a significant topic. He stated that the show must focus on realizing his dream rather than only making fun of his mess. His true ambition was to maybe transform the chaos into something lovely by working with a small team to restore vintage cars. Mike Hall did not retire quietly or slow down at the age of 60. Rather, he let the world in by opening the gates of his rusted realm. He consented to film a show with the help of Cora Studios and Mayhem Entertainment, which would finally compel him to put the hundreds of automobiles he had accumulated over the years to good use. He constructed an actual workshop on his Tappan, British Columbia, property. He gave it the name Rust Browers Restorations and surrounding it with mountains of corroded classics. The show had a straightforward concept. Take his favorite automobiles and try to make them into gold again by fixing, polishing, and selling them. However, everybody who knew Mike was aware that this was more than just a business concept. In addition to his own strong personal attachment to the cars he was attempting to part with, it was a battle against time and deterioration. Filming for the television program Rust Valley Restorers began in 2018. Mike immediately introduced his best friend Avery Schuff, a bearded heavy equipment mechanic with enormous muscles and much more opinions. He was called the MacGyver of the muscle car. Mike also introduced his son, Connor Charman Hall, a cool-headed, sensible young man who always seemed to be tidying up the financial disaster his father made. Sarah Ward took care of the pieces, while Cassidy McCone participated as a body technician. A mismatched group of automotive enthusiasts, they shared a similar interest. When the rest of the world had given up on salvaging autos, they still had hope. The show didn't have the typical high-end car show atmosphere or appearance. Dramatic surprises and eye-catching graphics weren't the point here. It was about actual people in a tiny community attempting to realize their dreams. The debut of Rust Valley Restorers took place on December 6, 2018. It was a huge hit on Canada's History Channel. The audience was captivated by Mike's unbridled enthusiasm, enormous heart, and unattainable hope. He didn't have a business-like appearance or demeanor. He spent money like it grew on trees and spoke his mind as a 6-foot-something hippie. He claimed in one episode that this store had almost killed him before acknowledging that he had invested close to $2 million in it. It was obvious that he wasn't in it for the money, despite his attempt to backtrack a bit by referring to it as an investment in his metallic hallucinations. They should be turning a profit, Connor kept reminding him, but Mike always constructed the cars too nicely, spent too much, and then refused to sell them. Because he liked the buyer, he would frequently grant a discount even when he sold a car. He once declared that he would lose money if it meant fulfilling people's desires. And it was commonplace. The few fortunate enough to score a dream car at a discount will never forget it. It had an adverse effect on Rust Bros' financial results. The figures, however, didn't matter to the audience. It was heart they saw. And Netflix noticed. The sitcom was picked up for international streaming in 2019. All of a sudden, Rust Valley gained fame. The renowned junkyard and the possibility of meeting the Rust Brothers crew were the main draws for car enthusiasts from all over the world who came to Tappan. Like a child in a candy store, Mike frequently gave tours himself. Mike's bond with his son was one of the show's best elements. Connor's affection for his father was evident, yet frequently found himself in the role of the adult. Emotion was Mike's guide. Connor was logical. And their tugging and pushing somehow produced magic. Their relationship was strong despite their disagreements over timetables and finances. The event was about more than just vehicles in many aspects. Love, loyalty, and the transmission of a dream from one generation to the next were the main themes. Avery Schuff contributed a distinct energy. Loud, witty, and full of advice, Avery frequently tried to persuade Mike to handle money a little more wisely. Avery even quit Rust Brothers to open Wild Man Restorations, his own store, at one point. There was no animosity despite the fans' amazement at that action. Avery continued to participate on the show, continuing to assist Mike and even co-creating a spin-off with Big Donnie Kleinfelder in 2021 called Backroad Truckers. The Rust Valley universe continued to expand. The supporters witnessed every high and low during the 4 seasons from 2018 to 2021. They saw Mike save cars that were about to vanish forever. They saw deadlines go apart, dreams almost fall apart, and finances blow apart. After estimating a client would need $15,000 to restore a 1966 Lincoln Continental, Mike discovered that the actual cost would be far more. But rather of leaving, he stayed on the job and accepted the loss. He would not disappoint anyone. It was Mike Hall. By 2020, when Season 3 arrived, Mike Hall's life behind the scenes was already becoming difficult. Rust Brothers was not a cheap operation. It was not supported by large corporate funding. The majority of Mike's payments came from personal funds. Operating the shop without generating consistent earnings, purchasing parts, and paying employees. He also acknowledged that he never truly had a company plan and that his buddies frequently made fun of his poor financial management skills. That was no longer hilarious, though. He began to feel the burden of the bills by the end of 2020. He started to give retirement some real thought once more, something he had put off in order to keep the shop open for the show. But money wasn't the only factor. Mike was growing older and his health was a serious problem. After years of scaling cliffs and inhaling paint fumes, he once half-jokingly remarked that he might die tomorrow. What would happen to the cars, he pondered, if that occurred? Then something unexpected occurred that the crowd were not prepared for. Early in 2021, it was discovered that the area where the Rust Bros yard was located was in fact zoned for farming. Mike was not allowed to operate a full-scale auto restoration company on what was an agricultural land reserve in British Columbia. The local government had ignored the situation for years. Mike was warned he was out of limits by the Columbia Shoe Swap Regional District when he began constructing a new workshop in January 2021. He needed to apply to the Agricultural Land Commission for a specific exemption in order to continue operating lawfully. The local board endorsed his application, highlighting the positive economic and tourism impact of the Rust Brothers store. In May 2023, however, the commission formally rejected it. Rust Brothers abruptly turned into an illegal company on paper. Mike was no longer even the land's owner at that moment. Mike was now only a tenant as the property had been taken over by a new owner. They frantically tried to find a solution. The shop may be located on a smaller plot of land that would be easier to rezone if the land were divided. Early in 2025, local officials approved the idea because they liked it, but the stress of the entire situation had already taken its toll. Then the fires broke out. It was a terrible summer in British Columbia in 2021. And the collection of vintage cars in Mike's yard was like a match ready to be struck. Everything may be destroyed if a tiny grass fire got to his collection. Mike had to make a difficult choice as a result of this dread, the financial strain, and the legal pressure. He planned to sell. Mike sold the Tappan property in secret in the middle of 2021. However, the cars were not part of the agreement. He had to move them, then. He therefore organized a large auction with no reserve prices. The October 2, 2021 date was chosen. The goal was to sell more than 500 cars in a single day, many of which had not been driven for decades. It was surreal. "I'm going to lose 40 years of my life in a single day," Mike stated. There were autos that sold for several $100. Some sold for more than $10,000. However, Mike ignored the money. All he wanted were excellent homes for the cars. He even requested that buyers email him pictures if they were able to restart the vehicles. Only 50 of the automobiles remained after the sale. About 30 of Mike's favorite vehicles, primarily muscle cars and a Dodge convertible, were kept. They were dispersed throughout the United States and Canada. Mike was really affected by that day. The entire event was a haze, he claimed. It made him sick to see vehicles he had owned for 30 or 40 years move away on trailers. But there was also relief. The yard was at last clear. The zoning issue was no longer an issue. His family was silently relieved that the enormous overhead had disappeared, especially his son Connor. Mike was 65 at the time of the sale. According to him, that seemed like the correct thing to do. Rust Valley Restorers broadcast the entire auction as part of their Season 4 finale in the spring of 2022. Supporters believed it to be the end. His dream had been sold by Mike. It appeared to be a finished show. But a startling incident occurred behind the scenes. Rather than leaving, Mike was immediately drawn back in. People began offering him more cars after the transaction. He made a joke about how his collection began to expand again when the field was cleared. Without making an effort on his part. He had around 200 cars once more by 2023. He claimed that they simply found me. Suddenly, the cars returned after one call about an old Buick and another about a Pontiac. Though Season 4 appeared to be a farewell, Chorus Studios and the History Channel weren't finished. They had filmed fresh episodes, as Mike intimated in interviews. He said they had already finished 8 episodes, starring him, his son, and Avery. Throughout 2022, these were filmed, including winter test drives with vehicles that shouldn't have been on snow. It was adored by fans. Season 5 finally debuted in the fall of 2024, showcasing the team's transition to life following the significant sale. They were in the same spirit, but with a new structure, a smaller business, and fewer cars. Two vehicles that were very important to Mike were a 1941 Diamond T-Truck and a 1968 Shelby GT350 Mustang. One plot line dealt with a near loss of access to a major lot they were using. An additional reference to the ongoing land conflicts. But Mike continued to move forward. Restoring vintage automobiles was in his blood, he informed supporters on Live, and he had no intention of letting up. Mike began serving as a brand ambassador for eBay Motors Canada off-camera. He demonstrated his part hunting methods and offered online car advice. People claimed he was still lively and passionate, even during Zoom interviews. Giving up the enormous collection allowed him to relax. He could now relish his occupation once more. Although Rust Brothers Restorations is still in business, it has become smarter and leaner. Mike chooses a small number of assignments at a time and concentrates on completing them well. Additionally, he attends vehicle exhibitions and charity events in British Columbia. Having learned his lessons the hard way, he now acts as a sort of mentor to young mechanics. His narrative has encouraged people to pursue their passions, take chances, and perhaps lessen their concern for financial gain. Mike is currently in his late 60s. I continue to live in the shoe swap with his dog and wife. His relationship with Connor appears to be stronger than ever. Mike's wife isn't in the spotlight, but you can bet she's glad the rusting automobiles are gone from the backyard. Additionally, Mike has taken on the role of a grandfather figure in the automotive world. He is admired since he created something out of passion rather than for financial gain. Rust Valley has evolved beyond a television program. It is a tradition. A rusty fender and a nice narrative will always appeal to Mike, even if he never again collects 500 automobiles.